As a woodworker, I like to use my craft to make gifts for others. Today's project is a wooden box with a wooden bow on top. The size makes it perfect for small items like jewelry, so perhaps you could include another gift inside the box for a double surprise. I made this box from walnut and maple, and I think the two contrasting colors make a great impression. You can, of course, make this from different contrasting woods, or even make the box from just one. This box may even allow you to use some of those exotic wood scraps you've saved for the right project. I found this one a while back. It's dated August 14th. And this box here with a bow. And so there's the finished version. And here's what it looks like as far as the different parts. I found some 8-quarter maple. And it was big enough to make 2 of these. So I'm going to take these 2 pieces. The outside dimensions are 4 3/4. The inside dimension, there's a 1/4 inch side. They're all 1/4 inch sides. I drilled a 1/8 pilot hole near one of the corners of the block to make it easy to thread the blade through for the inside cut. The material is 1.5 inch thick maple, so I'm using a number 12 Pegasus modified geometry blade. I chose my blade size based on the thickness and hardness of the wood, plus the complexity of the pattern I will be cutting. Those 3 factors made the number 12 the obvious choice. For a complete discussion of blade size choices, I left a link to my video on the subject on the screen and in the description. I cut from the pilot hole to the nearest edge, but didn't try to make a sharp 90-degree corner. I'll come back and clean up this corner once I've cut around the perimeter. The 4-inch plus length of the side took a bit of time to cut. I was tempted to push harder on the blade to speed things up, but I know from experience that doesn't work. If you put too much pressure on the blade, it's likely to flex, and you won't get a 90-degree vertical cut on the box's insides. Doing this could also cause the blade to overheat and burn the wood or break the blade. None of these are desired outcomes. Just take your time and let the blade do the work. Scroll sawing is not a hobby, or a business, for impatient people. I did my best to create a sharp 90-degree angle at the next corner. I cut right up until I touched the line for the new direction, then backed off pressure on the blade very slightly, just enough so it wasn't cutting. I used the kerf just created, plus the waste material, to turn the material 90 degrees to the next direction I wanted to cut, and then I eased the wood back into the blade to start cutting. Thick, hard maple is problematic for making 90-degree turns, but this one seemed to go well. If the corner turns out to be slightly rounded, I can always touch it up later. From the second to the third corner, it was just more of the same slow cutting due to the hardness and thickness of the wood. I made the third corner the same way as the second, and then I had one more long, straight cut. The fourth corner and fourth side were more of the same. To paraphrase Robin Williams in Good Morning Vietnam, that phase of the project was boring as whale crap. After returning to the starting place, I pulled the sizable square waste piece from the center and tightened the blade again in the upper blade holder. The corners needed a little work, so I used the blade to clean them up. You can also use a file to do this step if you prefer. Either way, I think the corners look better sharp than rounded, but you could deliberately cut them curved if you like that look and feel. The bottom, top, and top spacer are all cut from 1/4 inch thick walnut, so I switched to a number 3 Pegasus modified geometry blade. When you pluck the blade, as I did just a few seconds ago, it should produce a musical note that tells you you have the proper tension on the blade. I could have made the rips and cross cuts for these parts on the table saw, but they're small, and even the scroll saw makes quick work of them. Which tool you use is a matter of personal preference. The scroll saw isn't great for making long, straight cuts, but these are short, and the edges can be touched up on the disc sander if they turn out a little wavy. I trimmed one edge of the pattern with scissors right down to the line, and then I attached that side to an edge of the board that had been run through the table saw, so I knew that edge was clean and 90 degrees to the board's surface. The corners are rounded on the top and bottom pieces, so when I started cutting on the edge, I cut that curve and followed along the straight line of the side. I made that curve at each of the other corners, then cut the straight line. If you prefer, you can cut the corners square and then round them later with a sander. You could even cut and leave them square, but I like the effect of the rounded corners myself.
I peeled the scroll saw tape and pattern off the bottom of the box and then reached over to the counter next to the scroll saw to pick up the middle piece, which forms the sides of the box. I set the maple piece on top of the walnut bottom, so now we both have a better idea of what the finished piece will look like. The top and top spacer were cut similarly to the bottom, so there was nothing new to show on that step. I pulled the scroll saw tape and pattern from the top, then placed the spacer on the bottom side, which I will glue as the next step. The spacer is just a tiny bit too large to fit into the sides, but that's okay. I'll take it to the disc sander and take off just enough from the edges to fit snugly into the opening. It's time to make the bow, composed of two parts. I'm making the central part of the bow from 3/4 inch maple, which will contrast nicely with the walnut top of the box. I drilled pilot holes for the inside cuts and will use a number 9 Pegasus modified geometry blade. The inside cuts for the bow's top are teardrop shapes, so they'll take a bit of care to look good. I started by cutting from the pilot hole to one of the sides and followed the line to the point at one end. Rather than trying to make that very tight change of direction, I backed the blade up to the pilot hole, and then I cut from there along the opposite side of the space until I reached the point again. The blade caught the loose waste piece and flipped it out of the cut. Now I could start in the space just cleared and follow the cut line all the way around the rest of that cut, since there was a curve rather than a point at the other side of this space. At one point in this cut, I could feel I was getting a bit of extra vibration, which indicated that the blade was likely becoming loose in the lower blade holder, so I stopped cutting and tightened the blade before proceeding. The remaining interior cuts were performed precisely as this first one, so there was no need to show the same maneuvers 5 times. After completing these, I tightened the blade in the upper blade holder, and that sound when I plucked the blade told me I had the proper tension. I started the outside cut on the bottom of the bow, where the line began to curve upwards. Several curves are involved in making this cut, and at the end of each curve, there's a change of direction that involves a difficult blade movement. Here's how I can get such tight changes. I followed the cut line around the curve until I reached the point where the direction change is needed. At that point, I stop advancing the blade and pull it back a bit. Now I use the curve just created, plus the waste area, to turn the wood 180 degrees, and then I back the blade to the point where I had stopped cutting before. Now it takes only a slight change of direction to start following the cut line again. The rest of this exterior cut was accomplished by repeatedly following these steps. There was one spot where the blade didn't want to back into the point, but I continued cutting, and when I was done with the exterior cut, I went back and cleaned up that little spot. The flat part of the bow is made from 1/4 inch Baltic birch plywood. It's challenging to plane maple that thin, and the color is close enough that I doubt it will be noticeable. I replaced the number 9 blade with a number 3 Pegasus modified geometry blade to cut this part of the bow. I cut a small piece of plywood for this part and used a glue stick to attach the pattern. Glue sticks are inexpensive, you can get them anywhere school supplies are sold, and they're perfect for gluing patterns to small pieces of wood. The trick is to get enough glue on the paper so it holds while cutting, but not so much that the pattern is difficult to remove when you're done cutting. Because all the lines were near the edges of the plywood, I took the easiest and fastest method of making the cuts. I started at an edge and first made one of the 2 long curved cuts. Next was the straight line that would butt up against the vertical bow piece. I kept moving around and made the other long curve next. I made the small triangular cuts like I cut most right angles. I cut until I reached the point of the angle, and then I ease off the pressure on the blade slightly. The blade is now running in the curve it just created, and I use the curve plus the waste area to turn the workpiece in the next direction I need to cut before pushing the wood into the blade again. I use the alternate way to make a triangular cut next. I started cutting at the edge of the plywood, cut until I reached the intersection where the cut line changed direction, stopped cutting, and backed the blade out to the edge. I started cutting on the second line from there and followed it to the point where it touched the first line. The waste piece is now loose and can be removed. The rest of the cuts are made this same way. That's it, the bow is now complete. I have to remove the patterns from the 2 pieces, do a tiny bit of touch-up sanding, and then I can glue the bow to the top of the box. The spacer was a tad too large to fit in the box's opening, so I used the disc sander to make it a bit smaller. Just a few quick touches against the disc were all it took. The spacer needed to go inside the box, not enough to be a friction fit, but with a little play. Wood expands and contracts with changes in heat and humidity, and I don't want the walnut top to get stuck if the wood expands a different amount than the maple sides. The spacer gets glued, centered on the underside of the box top. Before gluing, double-checking the fit one more time is always a good idea. There was a small knot in the walnut spacer, so I flipped it over to see which side looked better. I'll glue the worst-looking side to the top where it will be hidden from view. Another thing I checked was to make sure the grain was running in the same direction on the top and spacer. A cross-grain situation can cause wood to crack as glued pieces expand and contract. I squeezed some glue onto the back of the spacer, and then I used my fingertip to spread it around. It's important to cover the entire area, especially the edges. A good bond will prevent the two pieces from falling apart. I centered the spacer on the top, and then I placed the box sides over it to double-check the placement. That done, I removed the box, placed the spring clamp on each corner of the assembly, and set it aside for the glue to cure and dry. I switched to a glue bottle with a tiny tip to add glue to the narrow sides of the box, and once again used my fingertip to spread the glue. Then I centered the walnut box bottom over it. Since the vise on the end of my workbench was handy, I clamped one side of the box and bottom assembly in it and added a couple of F-clamps to the other side. The last step before finishing is to add the bow to the top. The plan showed the bow with two colors, but I didn't want to spend the extra time to make the fancier bow. I think the light maple box contrasting with the dark walnut top will look outstanding. I added glue to the bottom of the bow's two pieces, then set them in place on top and placed spring clamps on the thin part of the bow. There was no practical way to clamp the tall part of the bow, so I relied on gravity to do that job for me. Making boxes is particularly satisfying, maybe because they're valuable and beautiful. So, what do you think of this project? Are you going to make one? I respond to every comment and would love to hear from you. If you've watched this far, you must have enjoyed the video, so a like would be appreciated. This tells the YouTube algorithm to recommend the video to others. Subscribing and hitting the notification bell are ways to ensure you catch every new video I release. But if you can't wait until next week, 2 suggestions for videos to watch right now are on the screen.